Hi there, it's me, Jordan Van Haslo. Welcome to Jordan Van Haslo and Friends live on Hot 702.5 FM Las Vegas. Let's get on with the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Showtime with Jordan Van Haslo and Friends right here on Hot 702.5 Las Vegas. I am so very excited to introduce this week's friend to you. I can't wait to have a conversation with him, and I can't believe we haven't had an opportunity to have a conversation before. He is known by many as the Godfather of Reality television, having been the creator of Real People on NBC. He also was the original host of AM LA, a little bit before my time, but I know many of you out there in radio land know the show. And he's worked and interviewed with so many comedians and even used to write for Frank Sinatra. He's also produced 3 different documentaries, and his third and final docu is called John Barbour's and William Shakespeare's Last Word on the Murder of JFK. And it's going to have a screening. It's going to have actually 3 screenings next week on November 22nd at the Limley Town Center 5 in Encino, California. And I am so very happy to welcome him, and I can't wait to learn his story. Ladies and gentlemen, John Barbour. Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Well, Jordan, I'm absolutely thrilled, but listen, you better get off of radio and get onto television. I mean, you're such an interesting looking guy. You don't look like any guy whose middle name is Vaughn, okay?
I say all the time, it's like I disappoint everybody anytime I walk into a room because they see my name, and then I walk in and I'm like, hello, and they're like, who's this? Are you?
And if you can see me in my office, and you see pictures of me with Frank Sinatra, Jane Fonda, and the posters for a couple of my movies, and there I am with Governor Ronald Reagan. Oh my God! And not only that, I'm delighted that you're from Las Vegas, or you're in Las Vegas. Well, because when I first came to America, when I was 7...
Canada, right? You're from Toronto originally, yes?
Yes, and I was born in the charity ward of the Salvation Army Hospital, the 2 parents who didn't want me. I came from a severely dysfunctional home before it was popular. And my mother and father fought so severely in 1939, my father figured he'd be better off if he took on the Germans with a gun. So he joined the Canadian Army, lost half his stomach, got the Order of the British Empire, and never came home. And then my mother, who was just a modest drinker to begin with, became a serious drinker and brought uncles into my house that I didn't even know we had. And brought them in grapes, in bunches. And they were there to bed with her and booze with her, but mostly beat her. So, Jordan, from the time I was 6, like a Canadian kid, I spent half of my time on a hockey rink, half of my time at a theater watching for 5 cents double features, fell in love with America, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, okay? Oh, God, Gary Cooper, I'm telling you, I fell in love with America. I spent a lot of time in jail, and when I was released from the jail, I'd go across to the library and read. Now,
this is when you were young, like you were like a little juvie?
Yeah, I was a juvie. I was 13 when I became an inveterate gambler. And I was an inveterate gambler until I was about 16. And I lost everything that I could earn and steal. And I could steal quite a lot, okay? And there were about 8 of us. The oldest was a military guy, a guy who was in the military. And I was the first one to lose everything, and the last one to leave. And then, Jordan, one day I said to myself, I don't want to do this. I'm not here to make money. I'm here to make friends. But I don't want to be friends with these kinds of people. One day when I got out of jail, I went across and I read, look, I can remember this after 75 or 80 years. 2 books, John Scarney on dice, John Scarney on cards, and I memorized them. So over a 3-month period, I realized I didn't have to be in every pot. I won $700, and I went out and I bought a $600 suit. I took a bus to Niagara Falls. I walked across Niagara Falls, and they said, where are you going? And I said, I'm from the Canadian side of the falls. I want to see the American side of the falls. They said, okay. So then I got on a train to go to Las Vegas. So in northern Nevada, the train stops. There's an accident, but I thought that the Mounties had called the railroad and said, hey, we need to get this Johnny Barbour. So I hopped off the train. The only place I could get to was the Cal Neva Lodge. So I get on the bus, I go to the Cal Neva Lodge, and Jordan, it was so magnificent for me. Here I am dressed in this $600 suit, and I'm wearing a Stetson because I want them to think I have cattle, that I'm old enough to gamble. It's like I walk into an MGM set. Where's Judy Garland? Where's Mickey Rooney? So I go to the end of the crap table and I'm doing okay. And suddenly people start looking at me and I thought, oh my God, they know I'm 17. They're going to call the cops and I'm over with. But soon they were looking past me, Jordan, and I turned around and guess who walked through those glass doors? It was Frank Sinatra.
Oh my God.
And Sam Giancana, arm in arm. And Sinatra had this black overcoat on, like an Italian Superman, and there were about 3 or 4 Italian Praetorian guards there. And how would a 17-year-old know that was Giancana? I left the paper on the train, so I had just read about it. Now everything stopped as he just walked by. A week earlier, I had seen him in a movie called "Till the Clouds Roll By." Do you remember that film? It was about
I do. It's the Jerome Kern. It's the Jerome Kern bio.
That's right. In the very end of the film, he's on a white pedestal, singing Old Man River. Well, it's beautiful. So then 25 years, quite by accident, I became for 4.5 years his private writer. So I'm going to tell you one cute story.
Well, before you go to your cute story, I just have to ask one question.
Sure.
So this $600 suit, so you were wearing the same suit, walking across the Canadian-American border on the train all the way to Nevada? Like, did it still look like a $600 suit by the time you got there?
Great question. Yes, I had absolutely no luggage. I had nothing, listen, I was deported twice from the United States at 17 and 20. And at 46, I was absolutely unemployable because I'd been the most quoted film critic. I was the first critic in America to review movies on the news. I was 10 years at LA Magazine, 5 years at NBC in Los Angeles. And when I lost that job, I was totally unemployable at 46. And then the next year, by accident, I get Real People on NBC, and I'm there for 3 years, the most successful show in the history of American television. I'm making $30,000 a week. So, but I have to tell you this first cute story. I love talking to you, by the way, and I wish the audience could see just how nice looking and interesting you are. And you got the greatest smile. So anyway,
thank you.
Listen, my game was blackjack, and they used to, if you know Vegas well, now that's like 4 decks of cards. But then when I came here, it was 1 deck of cards. So, and that was my game, and I could do well. But you can't gamble more than an hour a day, for God's sake. And then what else are you going to do? Well, I only had 1 movie theater in Vegas at the time. There were only 25,000 people there then. There are 3.5 million here now. And so I would go to the shows. And the stars that I saw Joey Lewis with Lily St. Cyr I saw Edith Piaf. I
Oh,
saw
wow.
Noel Coward. And my God, I thought, and so I'm sitting at the table one day, and you might recognize the feeling. The feeling I had was I had an empty life. I had a full pocketbook, but I was the unhappiest young person I knew. I wanted a life with a purpose. So I just got up, cashed in my chips, never gambled again. And since I loved movies as a kid, I got on the train and I went to Hollywood. Now, this is the first kid story that I want.
Before you go, because I want to hear this story to Hollywood, but I'm also curious, going back to your $600 suit. So when you came across the border, did you have an intention? Like, was Vegas your intention, or was it just kind of like a thing of like you're walking around? It's like, oh yeah, I think I'm gonna like it here. Let's go to the Amtrak and just.
I said Vegas was my goal because that's the Vatican. If you're a gambler, that's Mecca. So it's paradoxical because that's where I live now. But in any event, I end up going to Los Angeles, and I'm in a boarding house at La Brea and Hollywood Boulevard, and there are all 8 males there, and a lovely lady who does the cooking and everything. And you weren't even born then, and you may have read about it or heard about it, but it was America's very worst time, which I knew little about, but I experienced it. It was the McCarthy era.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a blacklisting area at the time. I knew nothing about that. So at dinner time, that seemed to be all the conversation about all the commies running around, okay? And there was a 28-year-old mechanic who always wore a really nice suit. And in his lapel, he had a little button that said, "Better dead than red." Mm-hmm. Does that bring any memories back to you? It sound familiar to you?
Well, not any memories, but I do know that slogan. I've read about that slogan.
It was all over America. And I used to tease him. I said, "Hey, you idiot." I called him an idiot. I shouldn't. He was 10 years older than me. I said, "If you're trying to change anything, you can't if you're dead. Okay, you're going to be feeding worms, you know."
What was that time period like, not being an American? Like, were you kind of seeing all this happening, thinking like, this is a weird place, or like, what was that like from your perspective?
It scared me a little because that's all that was on the news was hate. It's like America now.
It's like now.
That's all I see is hate. So in any event, this is how cruel this guy was. He hated Franklin Roosevelt. Never knew him. He's 28. And he said, Roosevelt was a commie, and God crippled him and the reason he crippled him because he's a commie, and the reason he didn't blind him because he wanted him to wake up in bed and look at that ugly wife of his. Oh my God. And I mean, he decimated him. And I said to him, "Hey, hold it. I'm down here and I want to be an actor." And so I'm wandering around and I don't know much about America yet. And I hope to learn everything. I said, "But I do know from the history classes that I read about in the newspaper, I heard in the news, that the recession or depression in America was caused by a Republican named Hoover." As I go around Los Angeles, I see Roosevelt Golf Course. I see Roosevelt High School. I see Roosevelt Boulevard. I see Roosevelt Parks. And I say the only thing named after Hoover is a vacuum cleaner. Oh, my God. The people there laughed and cheered, and this guy got up and ran away upstairs. I knew immediately what he was doing. He was calling the FBI.
And say, like, we've got a commie here, and a Canadian commie on top of it.
Yeah, and they sensed it. So I ran upstairs to my room, and I was climbing out the window because I was really used to running away from cops. And there were 3 cars down below, FBI jumping out. "Stay there, Mr. Barbour." I'm just a kid. They called me Barbour.
Were you wearing the $600 suit?
No, not well. They were casual, and I was able to buy some different clothes, for God's sake. So in any event, the two cops come in, two FBI, very polite, and they say, could we see your visa, please? And I said, well, I don't have a visa. And he said, well, how'd you get into the United States? I said, I just walked across the
I
border.
walked. It's like how to get to Carnegie Hall.
Yeah.
I took a taxi.
Yes, that's right. And he said, how long did you say you were going to be here? And I said, a day. And he said, how many days have you been here? And I said, 365. So they chuckled and they said, we're coming with us down to headquarters. So they took me down to the FBI headquarters, fingerprinted me, and they started chuckling amongst themselves. And they said, you know, this kid is no threat to the American government. He is just a threat to shop owners in Toronto. So we'll just turn him over to the Immigration Service. So they turned me over to immigration, and they put me in a place, Jordan, called Terminal Island in San Diego. My God, it could have been a resort. It looked like Mar-a-Lago. And there are no armed guards, and there's the ocean to the west, and there are pastures to the right. And I thought to my, and I was on the third floor, and there were about 50 bunks, all occupied by Chicanos. I thought, you know, I cannot stay here. But they wouldn't deport me because they don't deport one person. They wait till they get 20 Canadians together. They call them the Canadian geese and let them fly back north in a group. I said, you know, I'm not going to stay here. And I asked, is there any way I could get out of here? And they said politely, if you can get $19, you can get what they call a voluntary departure. Now, I had deleted my mother, whom I loathed, and I deleted, sadly, my sister. And I thought, well, maybe my mother would give me $19. So, and I didn't have money for long distance phone calls, so I had to call collect. She answered the phone, and I told her where I was and the trouble I was having, and I needed $19.
Was that a difficult phone call, like having kind of separated from her? Was that kind of like, oh my goodness, I have to make this call?
Oh, God, you read me so well. I almost threw up on the phone. I didn't want to call her because I knew she hated me. And I was right. And I think the only reason she took the call to tell me that I was an absolute son of a bitch, just like her husband and my father. And I was such a bastard. I deserved to be locked up for the rest of my life. Then she hung up. Now, I don't speak Spanish, but Jose, who had the bunk next to me, every week, he was the guy that gathered all the laundry from the dirty laundry from the cots, put them in a big canvas bag, and when setting them down in a chute to the basement to be washed. So these guys really liked me, even though I couldn't speak Spanish. I loved the old Sid Caesar show, which had a lot of pantomime in it. So I'd do pantomime comedy for them, and they would applaud and cheer. They were really nice. So I convinced him in broken English and broken Spanish to help me get into this dirty bucket and send me down 3 floors to the ground. So I cased the place perfectly. Wednesday was the busiest day, and that means there'd be so many crowds, and since they're unarmed, they wouldn't notice me coming out of the basement and walking toward the bus stop, about a 50-yard walk, right close to the bus stop. And if I couldn't get out that way, I could go to the ocean side and I could swim to one of the boats. I was a really good swimmer, very athletic because I was such a good hockey player. He arranges for me. He gets all the stuff next to the chute, and he has one of his friends, bless him, fake that he was fainting. And when his friend fainted, the cops ran over to revive him. He stuck me in the bucket, put all his dirty clothes over me, dumped me down the chute. Now, I'm not religious, but I was praying, God, I hope there's some dirty clothes down there to land on. And there was a pile of dirty clothes. I was so happy. And again, I only had this one outfit. That's all I had. I mean, the other suit was long gone. So I rushed to the one on the west, and it's locked. The door is locked. And then I rush over to the east side to where the ocean is. My God, it's locked. And I run back and forth a few times and I panic and I get tired. And I'm so tired, I sit down on the dirty clothes and I fall asleep. And then a body starts shaking me. Wow, what do we have here? A live body inside of all these dirty clothes. Who are you? And I said, John Barbour. He said, what are you doing down here? And I said, trying to escape. So he said, well, come with me, young man, John Barbour. So they grill me for an hour to see if I have accomplices. When I convinced them I don't speak Spanish, I did this all on my own, they bring me upstairs, and when they opened the door, 50 Chicanas were standing there staring at me, wondering if I rapped. And they knew I did not rap on them. And so as the guy was leading me to my bed and telling me to sit down and wait for more Canadians to be arrested, I said to him, listen, why is it it's Wednesday and all the doors are locked? And he said, you idiots, July 4th, for God's sake. It's America's holiday. Well, the Mexicans screamed. And from then on, they called me Julio Cuatro. Here's the upshot of this. 30 years later to the day, I'm on Real People. And I get this letter. And this letter says, Dear Mr. Barbour, you must help me because I've been telling my mother and my father and my wife and my children and my neighbors that you are the guy that was in the dirty clothes that I rescued at Terminal Island. And they think I'm a liar. So please, 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 will you help me out of this dilemma? It has to be you. It just has to be you. So I sent him this gorgeous 8x10 glossy with me with my arms around Sarah Purcell, now in $1,000 suit. And I said, I'm so glad I have found you after all these years, because if I had never found you, I would either be on some fishing boat somewhere or in jail.
Best Julio Cuatro.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I love it. So you mentioned that you were deported twice. So after that, did you get deported back to Canada? And how did you come back?
Well, I came back the same way, and I got deported again by getting involved. God, you're so smart. Getting involved with another ultra-conservative accountant. I have to stay away from accountants, especially if they're young. This guy, I was living in the apartment above Mort Lockman and Bill Larkin, who were Bob Hope's head writers.
Mm-hmm.
And they loved me because I was working as a waiter at the time, but wanted to be a comic. And the reason I wanted to be a comic, my second favorite writer is Mark Twain. And Mark Twain said, the two greatest days in your life are the day you're born and the day you discover why.
I love that.
Great? Yes, so do I. And I discovered why the day I discovered Jack Paar. Do you remember Jack Paar?
Mm-hmm.
He was by far, he was the second host of The Tonight Show after Steve Allen, by far the very, very best. He was charming, he was witty, he was lovable, and he was intelligent, and he was curious. And he had conversations like you and I had. I didn't know people talked to one another. I thought they punched one another. As a matter of fact, Dick Cavett was one of his writers. But he opened his show with a funny monologue. So I decided, Jordan, I want to be the next Jack Paar. So I thought, well, I have to become a comic. Now, I didn't know how to be a comic. Didn't know any, but I loved comedians, but I didn't know how to be one. So I thought, well, let me see what they do. So I bought all of the albums of the great comics, Dick Gregory and Richie Pryor. I bought the Bob Newhart, Shelley Berman, Shecky Green, Mort Saul, but they all had a very distinctive personality and style. I had no style and I had no personality, and they had original material. I was just real plain. The only difference between them and me was that
You were Canadian.
Exactly. So I sat down and I thought, I'll write about the differences between Canada and America. And my very first line was, I am being brought, it was the height of the Black Power movement at the time. And I wrote 5 great, I didn't even know I could write a joke. And what I did is I got all the joke books, and I was going to steal the jokes. But any joke that was funny, everybody knew. And I thought, well, I can do better than that. So my very first joke, my name's John Barbour, and I'm appearing here through the courtesy of the NAACP. It was the National Association for the Advancement of Canadian People. And I was a smash. And a week later, I was working with Jim Neighbors at a club in Santa Monica. That's how I got started doing that. I didn't, and I knew this was supposed to lead somewhere, but I'm not sure where it was. So where was that?
You were talking about Jack Parr, and you wanted to become a comedian.
Yes. That's what it is. I wanted. So like, you're really good at what it is you do. When was it that you discovered why you were born?
When was it? Well, it was very, very early on. We could talk about that. Like, I've been doing this since I was like a kid. Like, I started out doing like catalogs and musical theater, and I actually ended up getting this show because I was headlining at the Tuscany.
Really?
In Vegas. I shared the room with the Rat Pack. And I came to the station to promote the show and got into a conversation with the owner of the station, and it ended into like an offer to do a show, which was really amazing because a couple of weeks thereafter, COVID shutdown happened, and so I've been doing this ever since. But this is what I like. I love talking to people. I love meeting people. I love so it's just, this is what I do when I'm not being paid.
Well, you're a natural at it. I'm delighted to talk to you. Now, I don't know whether you want to know about the first time that I met Jim Garrison, because my third final film on the subject is called John Barbour's and William Shakespeare's Last Word on the Murder of JFK, which opens in just a couple of weeks at the Town Center 5 Theater in Encino. And it's a really wonderful, interesting documentary because it catalogs the 53 years that I tried to tell Mr. Garrison's story, Jordan, while at the same time I'm trying to lead my own life and being successful in television and being a father to my son and, being a good husband and having a family that I never had. But it's the third. The first one was called the Garrison Tapes. The second one, which is the most definitive film ever made about the murder of John Kennedy, it'll be around 100 years long after Oliver Stone's magnificent JFK is forgotten, and long after every book is forgotten, and it only costs $2 on Amazon. But I have so many stories to tell you, I wouldn't know where to begin. So I have to wait for you to ask me some questions.
Well, so let's start at the beginning. So you've been deported twice. You come back. You finally find some success in Hollywood. You're making $30,000 a week. You're wearing $1,000 suits. You're no longer gambling, right? You're doing your thing. Where are you living at this point? Are you living in Hollywood? Or are you living in?
Yeah, I was living in Toluca Lake. I was a couple of doors away from Bing Crosby's house, Bob Hope's house.
So you were living the life. So
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does this whole JFK story come into your life?
Well, there used to be a thing called the Fairness Doctrine in broadcasting, which no longer
Mm-hmm.
exists because it was destroyed by Ronald Reagan, and I'll get to the reason why it was destroyed by Ronald Reagan. But there was,
As were many things, but
oh
that's
my God, yes. So yeah, he shut down all the insane asylums in California when he was governor. And I made a joke about the fact there were so many lunatics running around in the streets. They thought the only place they could get a place to sleep was to run for office. They could have elected, and that's what's ruling us now. But in any event, there were 20,000 Chicanos protesting the fact that at ABC in Los Angeles, none of them were being represented on television or in the news, or they weren't in the police department. They weren't in education. They weren't everywhere. They were like unknown, and some stations lost their license, and ABC did not want to lose their license, so they got rid of the cartoons and stuff in the morning and decided that they would have a 90-minute live news show. And they held auditions. And there was a young man named Mario Machado, he was like Ricardo Montalban, one of the most handsome human beings I ever saw. And he had this magnificent voice. Oh my God. And everybody thought Mario was going to be the host of that show. And I was working at a club in Pasadena called the Ice House with a young guy named Steve Martin. And after I sit, I go out in the foyer, and Mario comes over and gives me a hug. And he says, God, you are funny. You know, I just came from ABC, and the young producer, Brad Lockman, they're looking for a host of this show. And I suggest you call him and go over. I said, Mario, my God, you know, you're the one that's going to do it. You're Hispanic, for God's sake. You speak 3 or 4 different languages. You speak Portuguese, you speak Italian, you speak everything. You're everybody's ethnic. Well, he howled. He gave me the phone number. He said, you go over. And he said, the difference is, John, I am a great reader. I can read the news or commercials great. And you talk on your feet. You talk sitting down, you ad-lib, and your whole act is about politics. This whole show was about news. So I went over, auditioned, and I got the job. And it was really amazing, Jordan, because a couple of weeks earlier, I am doing stand-up comedy. My first album was called It's Tough to Be White in 1966. And guess who did the liner notes?
Who?
Dick Gregory.
Oh my God, I love it.
Yes, my wife. Have you ever heard the name Earl Father Hines?
Of course.
Oh, well, good for you, because Earl Father Hines was part of the original sextet of Satchmo, Louis Armstrong. But he didn't like Louis's lifestyle. Too many women, too much dope, and all that kind of stuff. So he quit and he went to San Francisco and he started a big band. My wife was his band singer.
Oh my God.
And as a result of that, her 2 best friends became Red Fox and Dick Gregory. And Dick Gregory became my mentor when I became a comic.
That's amazing.
Yes. And when I got my first show, entertainment show, I was the first one in America to put Red Fox on an entertainment show. And
wow.
Oh my God, the story, you know, he was Malcolm X's best friend.
I didn't know that.
Yes, he talked about how they were arrested together and how they used to sleep on the top of buildings in New York. I mean, it's so interesting. And he ad-libbed one of the funniest lines ever heard in television. And you know, It was as a result of his appearance on my show that he got Sanford and Son, because his real name is John Sanford.
Uh-huh.
And he called himself Fred because his older brother who died was named Fred. That's why he called himself Fred. But that show was really originally done in England as something called
Steptoe and Son, right? Or something like Steptoe. Yeah.
Very Good for You. And that's where Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin found it and turned it into that particular show. And in my book, which is called Your Mother's Not a Virgin, which is true, the bumpy life and times of the Canadian dropout who changed the face of American television. There are scores of hilarious stories, but this story is really funny. I booked him on the show, and everybody told me, don't book him on the show. He's a filthy comedian. And I said, no, listen, I'm telling you, that guy is very smart. Because when we were talking one time about Jim Garrison, and I said, what a hero, Jim, you know who Jim Garrison is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the DA in New Orleans, depicted by Kevin Costner in the movie. And when Oliver Stone was making the movie, he wanted to make a documentary with Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison said, no, John Barbour is going to make my documentary, first of all, because of real people. And secondly, he lost two of the greatest shows in American television. His morning show he lost because he tried to book me. Then when Real People became the most successful show in the country and he tried to put me on the air, he lost that show too. So John Barbour is going to be the one to tell my story.
Wait, so you lost both of these shows because you wanted to book them? Was it that you were like, they couldn't just say no? Or like, were you kind of going to the mat to really try to get his story out there?
Well, I was going to the mat because, you know, I survived as a kid listening to stories. So I wanted to grow up and be a storyteller. I wanted to be the next Jack Paar. So he got to tell stories and have his guests tell stories. And even if you're doing a one-line joke, it's still a funny short story, okay? When I got the AM show, it was 1967 when he arrested Clay Shaw. And he went on camera and he said, we are going to have convictions when we get into court. We have the money exchange, we have the shooters. And believe me, we are going to have a lot of people in jail after the trial. Now, everybody in America was told by everybody in the media and the government that this guy Garrison was an absolute kook. That's 1967. And a year goes by and 2 years go by. Now, I'm a street kid, and I'm saying to my friends, hey, hold it. If this guy has nothing, why don't they get out of his way and let him fall on his ass? Mm-hmm. And I lost a lot of my friends defending him when I didn't even know him. So one day I'm in a bookstore, Edmund's bookstore in Hollywood, across from Musso Frank's, one of my favorite restaurants in Hollywood.
I've been to Musso's forever.
Oh my God, I love that. You know, myself and Steven Spielberg are the only two people who have a credit card. And
Musso and Frank credit card? Really? Seriously?
Yeah, so anyway, I'm in this bookstore and I see Heritage of Stone underneath the author, Jim Garrison. And I thought, oh my God, is that the same guy? So I pick it up and I start to read and I learn things I never knew. That he had to take Time Life to the Supreme Court to get the Zapruder film to show the jury. And then there was a forensic pathologist named Fink who was called by the defense of Clay Shaw to talk about the autopsy. And then cross-examination, Fink says there was no autopsy because a general named LeMay kept stopping us. And all this magnificent information we never heard about. All we heard about was that he lost. He was a kook. He lost a conspiracy case. So in any event, I thought, God, I'm going to book him on the show. So the next morning, I call the DA's office in New Orleans. It's 6 o'clock in the morning in LA, 9 o'clock back there, and this bass baritone answers. And I said, could I speak to Mr. Garrison, please? He said, this is he. And I said, oh, my name is John Barbour. I just read your Heritage of Stone and I have this show. And he said, oh, John, you must be the other one. I only sold 2 copies. So yeah, have to love a guy like that. And I said, well, you know, I have the most successful morning show in America. I would love to interview you for a half an hour, open up the phones and let people call in, because often people who call in have better questions than the host, as was proof from the Larry King show. So, and he said, no, you'll never get away with it. And I said, why not? I said, I've just won my first Emmy. He said, would you repeat that? I said, I just won my first Emmy. And he chuckled and he said, oh, you plan on winning a few more? I fell in love with this guy. We talked for a half an hour about the assassination, 15 minutes about Shakespeare, because a lot of the titles in his book were right from Hamlet, right from Shakespeare. And then he says to me, he said, John, you know, it's 4 years after the Warren Report. And you know, it's strange you should call today, because last week there was a Harris poll that said 82% of all Americans do not believe Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone shooter or had to have an accomplice. And I said, well, Mr. Garrison, if so many people believe that, why aren't they storming the barricades of bullshit and demanding a real investigation? He said, well, you didn't see the second question in the quiz. And I said, well, what was the second question? He said, the second question, and would you like to see a deeper investigation into the murder of John Kennedy, where the FBI and where the CIA are not questioning, but questioned? And he said, what do you think the rate was then? And I said, what, 30, 40%? He said, no, 22%. I said, you're kidding. So he says, what's that tell you about the American people? And I said, well, I don't know what it tells you about the American people, but I know what it tells you about my mother. I know what my mother and father did in the rumble seat of the car or on the pool table or in the bedroom to conceive me, but don't ever tell me my mother's not a virgin. He howled. He said, my God, John, you sound like my second favorite writer, who is Mark Twain. He said, you know what Mark Twain said 100 years ago during the first fake war that America had with the Philippines, where we unnecessarily murdered 200,000 people? He said, you know what he said 100 years ago? I said, what? He said, if you don't read America's newspapers, you are uninformed. But if you do read America's newspapers, you are misinformed. You can't get any smarter than that. So I booked him on the show, and I was immediately fired.
Wow.
But in those days, you know, you're looking for a job in show business. I didn't think it had anything to do with plots or anything like that. It was, you know, and
like the politics of it all, you mean?
Like, I had no idea about that. I was selfishly only into becoming a star and becoming Jack Paar on television. That's all I was interested in. And the amazingly interesting thing, and this one of Red Fox's smart lines, Jim Garrison believed the Warren Report. Jim Garrison was a total independent. He had been an FBI agent himself. He was in the American military, in the American Air Force. The only picture in his office at the end of 1945, he was one of the first people at Dachau to liberate that death camp. And he has a picture on the wall, lest we ever forget. And it was an accidental meeting with Congressman Hale Boggs that convinced him that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the shooter. Now, Hale Boggs was the only dissenting member of the Warren Commission. And this is how most things happen by accident. And my life is a history of happy accidents, regardless of all the things that gone wrong. I am agnostic, but I must tell you, I believe in divine intervention because I've had so many magnificent things happen. So he's on a plane with Hale Boggs, and Hale Boggs is a hunter. And Hale says to him, Jim, I'm telling you, that crooked side on that manlock or cock handle, that kid couldn't shoot a dead rabbit with that damn thing. So Jim says, you mean? He says, yeah, it had nothing to do with it. Jim Garrison went out and bought 3 sets of the 26 volumes of the Warren Report. He had one in his car, one in his office, one at home, and he memorized it. And then in order to protect Clay Shaw when he arrested him, because he was going to originally arrest David Ferrie was murdered just before they were going to arrest him. And to make sure he was murdered properly, they found 2 suicide notes. I mean, so Garrison said, before I get 2 or 3 suicide notes from Clay Shaw, I better arrest him. So he arrested Clay Shaw. And oh my God, he was so interesting. But the thing was, he lost the conspiracy case, but he won the perjury case. And nobody knew what the perjury case was about. Now, in those days, Americans didn't understand about CIA. You know, it was a whole new phrase.
There was just crazy spooks and like men in dark suits who just...
That's right. You couldn't convince a jury. But how smart Garrison was. He got 10 years of his tax records, and his employer was the CIA. Still not able to convince them. But when Clay Shaw was arrested, he was arrested with all kinds of deviant, sadomasochistic pornography. And Jim Garrison related to men on men. And Jim Garrison told his staff, you are not reporting this to anybody because it has nothing to do with the murder of John Kennedy. That is his private lifestyle. Now, when he, in order also to protect his rights, he gathers 3 judges, the 3 best judges in Louisiana together to present his case against Clay Shaw. And Diamond, who's in my movie, who is Shaw's attorney, introduces the 26 volumes of the Warren Report to prove that Clay Shaw, who's not even mentioned in the Warren Report, did not murder John Kennedy. And guess what the 3 judges did? They threw out the 26 volumes of the Warren Report and called it hearsay because it was never an investigation. Did you ever hear Time Magazine or Newsweek Magazine or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal ever tell you that a court called it hearsay? The case would have been over and a dozen Americans would be hanging from lampposts for murdering John Kennedy. So in any event, what happened is that Clay Shaw denied knowing Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferrie and Jack Ruby and Jim Garrison, key witness. And what Jim had, he had 3 $20 mail hookers.
As one does.
Yes. They signed affidavits that talked about the $20 that they got paid to have homosexual sex with Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferrie and Clay Shaw et al. And then there was a professor for 1 year, lived with him, a professor at a university in Illinois, lived with Clay Shaw for 1 year, and Clay Shaw kicked him out after a year. And you know why he kicked him out?
Why?
The guy had a transgender operation, and Clay Shaw didn't want to be living with a woman. So the stuff they had that was amazing. They also had a guy that was to be paid $25,000 to murder Jim Garrison. And he thought about murdering Garrison because he had a very sick daughter, and the CIA promised him that he had the best doctors in the world. Instead, he thought it was more important that Jim Garrison solve the case of the murder of John Kennedy. So anyway, the federal government steps in. Garrison knew that Clay Shaw, who was one of the most revered personalities in New Orleans, very stylish, used to buy homes and redecorate them, a leading socialite. Everybody loved him, went to all of the great social parties. If these three kids and the professor get on the stand, he knows he's going to be somebody's bitch in prison, okay? And that he's going to say, like Perry Mason at the end, jump up at the end and say, I didn't. Yes, I was CIA. He knew it, and the government knew it. So they stepped in and stopped the prosecution of that case. There is so much proof. And it's a cold case now at the Justice Department because nobody ever saw the Zapruder film. We were told by Dan Rather that the bullet hits him in the back of the head and he's thrown violently forward. So we believed that until 1977, until Dick Gregory and Robert Grodin, get the Zapruder film on Geraldo Rivera's show. And they show it. And 2 million people are storming Congress. They need a new investigation. So they start a new investigation. And Robert Blakely, there was a guy named Richard Sprague, who, when he started, this is a great moment in the documentary, he said, I'm never hiring FBI or CIA. I'm going to investigate them because we're going to solve the murder of John Kennedy and also the murder of Martin Luther King, because these are the guys we're going to investigate. Well, there are 400 known assets in the media, in Congress, and in the Senate, all identified in the movie. And they gathered together and got rid of Richard Sprague. They put in Robert Blakely, a CIA hack, who was trying to blame the Italians and the mafia. Well, you and I all know if Italians killed the president, there's not going to be another pizza parlor in this country. They were hirelings only. And even Sam Giancana, the week before he's to testify at the House Select Committee, he's cooking pasta with his best friend in his basement. His friend gets behind him, puts a bullet in the back of his head. He falls to the ground and he puts 6 bullets around his mouth. That's what they tell you, to keep your mouth shut. And then there was another who had just testified at the House Select Committee, was supposed to go back, and they found his body in pieces in the Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, wow.
And none of the newspapers or Blakey or any of these comment about these horrible, horrible deaths. And there are 87 of them listed in my second movie, when there were actually about 300 mysterious deaths of witnesses. But so we get back to Red Fox. When I'm telling him this and he's talking about heroes, he says, heroes ain't born, they're cornered. But I wanted to get to this wonderful joke about Red Fox. He comes on the show. It's during the time of the Black Power movement and all that stuff. And I know his act very well. And let's see, we had a couple of other comics on the show at the same time because I wanted to do a show with comics. The other two, one was white, the other one was Jewish. The other was not Jewish, but he was also white. Okay, so anyway, Red comes on and he walks out. And he, when the Scots play golf, they have these like short pants. They call them knickers,
Mm-hmm.
So he comes walking when I introduce him. Lady and gentlemen, my very best friend is going to be Perry Como's opening act in Las Vegas, by the way. So he's coming on my show for the first time on television. And he walks out there and he's dressed so smart and he's got his usual cigarette. And he looks at the audience and he sort of pats his pants. And he says, I was just down south, you know? And he said, I heard all these people looking at me and yelling at me about knickers. So I thought I'd go out and buy a pair. Well, that's not, I mean, that's one of the great funny jokes about the N-word. Anyway, he sits down, and I asked him, Red, how do you feel about the Black Power movement or white power or anything? And he says, John, he said, listen, I don't care nothing about Black Power, and I don't care nothing about white power. I only care about green power. He said, because if you got green power, you can buy the places where the whites and blacks hold their meetings. Everybody laughs. Now, I don't know where it came from, Jordan, and I didn't want to spoil his act, but just spontaneously, I said to him, hey, Red, why do you think money's colored green? Without missing a beat, he said, that's because Jews pick it before it gets ripe. Oh, it was the longest laugh in television history. We couldn't get the show going back.
Oh my God.
And when the laughter would die down, some people literally fell on the ground. Jack Carter jumps up, opens his wallet, pulls out a $20 bill, and he said, green power, and they all start falling apart again. So
I love that.
I mean,
love that.
You know, he and Jackie Mason were the only two comics I ever saw, except myself. I think one another would be Rodney Dangerfield, and who never bombed. And that was Jim. I told that to Jim, and he howled, and he said, well, it's true, John, because as I told you, I believed the government until I was cornered by the truth. And he said, and now why is it that you are passionate about doing the story? And I said, because I'm a storyteller, and I'm cornered by having the knowledge of the greatest crime story in 100 years in this country. And I could not live with myself if I didn't tell this story. So, Jordan, I've spent over $500,000 of my own money, and I've spent 53 years trying to tell Jim's story.
Can I tell you, I could sit here and talk to you all afternoon. I can't wait to see the latest documentary because it sounds so fascinating. So John Barbour's and William Shakespeare's last word on the murder of JFK. That's kind of a mouthful. And so if you're in Los Angeles, you can catch, there's going to be 3 screenings next Wednesday, the 22nd of November. There's a 1 o'clock, a 3 o'clock, and a 7:30 at the Limley Town Center 5 in Encino, California. And thank all of you out there in Radio Land on another episode of Showtime with Jordan Van Haslin and Friends right here on Hot 702.5 FM Las Vegas. Don't forget to download the Hot 702.5 app. It's available in the Google Play Store, and it's available at the Apple Store as well.